For 10 years, she lived in peace, until a knock on the door shattered everything she believed. It was a quiet Thursday in a neighborhood that thrived on routine. Lawns trimmed, windows cleaned, children's bikes parked in the same place every evening. The kind of suburb where nothing ever happened, until something did. Rachel Moore had just brewed her second cup of coffee, the same way she had every morning since she moved in. Mid-40s, widowed, a woman who had rebuilt her life from ash. The kind of woman who double-checked locks out of habit, not fear, not anymore. She opened the door expecting a neighbor, maybe a delivery. What she saw instead made her breath catch in her throat. Standing there was him. David Sloan, her ex, the man who had once nearly killed her, the man who was declared dead in a prison hospital 11 years ago. But he wasn't a memory. He wasn't a ghost. He was real and smiling. She slammed the door, heart racing, mind spinning. It had to be a mistake. It had to be someone else, a cruel look-alike, a trick of the mind. But it wasn't, because David Sloan had been living just 2 doors down the entire time. Before the quiet, there was chaos. Rachel Moore met David Sloan in her early 30s. At first, he was charming, charismatic in the way that made people listen when he spoke and flinch when he stopped. He was attentive, generous, disarming. The kind of man who made you feel like the only person in the room until he decided you weren't. The change came slowly. A sharp tone here, a slammed door there. The apologies were always louder than the outbursts, but the bruises began to last longer than the explanations. Rachel stayed longer than she should have, because leaving felt more dangerous than staying. Until the night it almost killed her. One argument turned violent. He choked her, slammed her into the kitchen tile. She blacked out, woke up in a hospital bed with a detective waiting. That night, Rachel pressed charges, and for the first time in years, she made a decision for herself. David Sloan was sentenced to 20 years for attempted murder. The trial was swift, the evidence was overwhelming, and for a moment, justice felt real. 5 years into his sentence, Rachel received a letter from the Department of Corrections. David had suffered a fatal heart attack inside his cell. No warning, no ceremony, just a death certificate. She didn't ask questions. No body was shown. No funeral held. It was over. At least, that's what she told herself. She sold the house they once shared, moved 3 counties away, built a new life in a neighborhood where no one knew her name, and more importantly, no one knew his. For 10 years, Rachel believed David Sloan was dead, because everyone said he was, and that was enough, until it wasn't. If stories like this grip you, if you're drawn to the shadows most people try to avoid, then subscribe to Actual True Crime. Like the video, leave a comment, and let us know what you would have done if David Sloan had appeared on your doorstep. Rachel had moved to Lakeland, Florida, a quiet city between Tampa and Orlando, known more for lakes and swans than secrets. It was the last place anyone would expect to find a man like David Sloan. But monsters don't hide in shadows. They hide in plain sight. David Sloan was never just a violent man. He was methodical, controlled, calculated. He wasn't driven by impulse. He was driven by ownership. The kind of man who didn't hurt because he lost control. He hurt because he needed to prove he had it. A court-ordered evaluation labeled him as having narcissistic personality disorder with antisocial traits. No empathy, no guilt, just strategy. To David, prison wasn't punishment. It was a temporary inconvenience. And death? Death was an opportunity. Records would later show how Sloan manipulated a dying inmate with similar features, bribed a prison nurse, and faked his own death with chilling precision. He disappeared from the system without ever leaving the state. And when he resurfaced, it wasn't to start a new life. It was to watch hers. 2 doors down, different name, same eyes. He'd been studying Rachel the way a predator studies prey. Not to strike immediately, but to savor the moment when she'd realize he had never left. For weeks, Rachel tried to convince herself it was just a coincidence. A man who resembled her ex. A man who had moved into her neighborhood in Lakeland, Florida, just 2 doors down, right after she thought she'd finally escaped her past. A man who had a strange familiarity that scratched at the back of her mind. But denial has a shelf life. It started with a comment. Daniel Scott, the man who introduced himself as her neighbor, mentioned something only David could have known. a favorite restaurant she once dined at in St. Petersburg, a vacation she'd taken in Key West only a year before, details she'd never shared with anyone. Then came the voice, a low tone, a subtle drawl, a way of speaking she hadn't heard in over a decade, the way David had spoken to her when he wanted to control her. Rachel tried to ignore it. She tried to write it off as a bad memory, but the scar was harder to forget. A faint line beneath his jaw, the kind of scar David had gotten years ago during a fight he'd provoked in prison. Rachel remembered how close he had come to her that night. She remembered the look in his eyes as she struggled to get away, but it was the whistle that shattered everything. 2 notes, one long, one short, a sound that had once been his signal to her, a kind of twisted command, a memory she had buried deep inside herself, until it came back with a vengeance. Rachel couldn't take it any longer. She called the police quietly. At first, it was just a tip. Something didn't sit right. A suspicion that grew each time she saw Daniel Scott walking past her window. The police dismissed it at first. Just a worried woman, they thought. Paranoia. But Rachel wouldn't back down. She demanded a DNA test. She swore to them that Daniel Scott wasn't who he claimed to be. Using an old coffee cup she'd found in the trash, investigators fast-tracked a test. The results were damning. David Sloan, who had been declared dead in prison from a supposed heart attack, was alive. And not just alive, but living right there in the same neighborhood in Lakeland. His real name, David Sloan, had been replaced by the alias Daniel Scott, a man who had no legal identity, no real history, just a shadow that had been grafted onto the face of a dead man. The investigation quickly unraveled into something more sinister. Tracing his fake identity back through various false records, investigators found a connection to a former prison guard in Miami. This guard, now retired, had been involved in several high-profile cases of missing inmates, and further digging revealed evidence of corruption, beyond anything the public could have imagined. But the biggest revelation came when they discovered something even darker, a multi-state identity laundering ring operating from Florida to Georgia and Alabama. Prisoners faking their deaths, disappearing, only to resurface with new names and new lives. But David Sloan didn't disappear. He stayed. And for him, this wasn't about freedom. It was about Rachel. He had never stopped watching, never stopped waiting. The tension in the air was thick, as if the entire city of Lakeland was holding its breath. Rachel knew what she had to do. She waited for the right moment, when Daniel Scott, David Sloan, was alone in his yard. Then, she did something she never thought she'd have to do again. She turned on her phone and began recording. It was subtle at first. A simple conversation about the weather, about the neighborhood. But Rachel wasn't listening to the words. She was listening for the slips. The details only he would know. The ones she couldn't deny any longer. And there it was. David Sloan's voice, laced with familiarity, speaking the same lies he'd always used. It was him. And this time, Rachel had the proof. With the recording in hand, she called the police in Lakeland. The authorities didn't waste a moment. They stormed his house, surrounding it from all sides. But David, calm, collected, unafraid, was prepared. A tense standoff unfolded in the quiet suburban streets. David stood at his window, his face illuminated by the fading light of day. For a brief moment, he just looked at the officers, as if this was all part of the plan. Then, without a word, he slipped into the back of the house. A chase through the backyard, the sound of footsteps echoing in the streets of Lakeland. He didn't make it far. When they finally captured him, there was no struggle, no resistance, just a strange, eerie calm. He smiled. His eyes gleamed, almost as though he were proud. As the officers cuffed him, he said something that would haunt Rachel forever. She needed to see me one last time. Rachel had thought that once David Sloan was behind bars, her nightmare would end. But the truth, as always, was more complicated than that. In the weeks that followed, Rachel found herself trapped in the grip of an invisible monster. Her life, her peaceful existence in Lakeland, had been shattered beyond repair. The media frenzy was relentless. Cameras outside her house, reporters calling at all hours, asking questions she wasn't ready to answer. Her past had returned, but this time it wasn't just about her survival. It was about her story, the one she'd buried so deeply, the one she'd thought she'd escaped. Every headline seemed to come with its own weight, and Rachel's own trauma began to manifest in ways she couldn't ignore. Sleep became a distant memory. Nightmares plagued her every time she closed her eyes. And the panic attacks? They hit harder than anything she could have imagined. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. That's what the doctors called it. But Rachel knew it was more than just a diagnosis. It was the quiet shadow that crept into every room, every conversation, every moment. Meanwhile, the legal system was facing its own reckoning. The case had exposed massive flaws in how Florida and the country handled inmate identification and death certifications. How had a man like David Sloan been able to disappear so completely? How had a convicted murderer been able to fake his own death with so little scrutiny? Investigators uncovered a chain of corruption that led directly to the state's Department of Corrections in Tallahassee. The death certificates, the forged documents, the lack of oversight. It was a web that stretched from Lakeland all the way to Miami and beyond. But it didn't stop there. The case was the tip of a much larger iceberg. What had started as a personal nightmare for Rachel Moore soon turned into a national scandal. Stories began to emerge of other prisoners, violent criminals, who had disappeared by faking their deaths. The method had been perfected over the years. Inmates with inside help were vanishing, their identities wiped clean. Some were never found again. The truth was more chilling than anyone had imagined. A rise in what was now being called ghosting the system. Criminals were learning to manipulate the legal system in ways no one thought possible, exploiting the very flaws meant to keep them behind bars. And it was all happening under our noses. Rachel sat alone in her home in Lakeland, the quiet of the evening settling in, though the silence felt empty. Her thoughts echoed in the empty rooms. I spent 10 years healing from a ghost. Turns out, ghosts can knock. Her voice carried the weight of every shattered moment. The years she had spent rebuilding her life, were now tainted with a truth she never thought she'd have to face. The fragility of it all, it haunted her. The truth she had believed in, the safety she thought she'd earned, the identity she had carefully forged over the years, all of it had been ripped away in the blink of an eye. David Sloan was dead. Or so she thought. It was so easy to trust in the narratives we create for ourselves. We assume they're unbreakable, but Rachel knew better now. Trust? It's a glass slipper on a cracked floor. It only takes one knock to shatter everything. What was worse was the realization that the world she had built was nothing more than a facade, a house of cards waiting to collapse. If a man like David Sloan could slip through the cracks of the system, could hide in plain sight for over a decade, how many others had done the same? Rachel looked out of her window, her gaze drifting to the houses nearby. You never really know who's living next door. Her words lingered in the air, a chilling reminder of the unpredictability of the world around us. The camera slowly zoomed out, the lights of Lakeland flickering in the distance, casting long shadows over the streets. The unsettling silence returned, and then ambient music, low and haunting, filled the background as the screen faded to black. If you found Rachel's story chilling, make sure to hit the subscribe button. Like the video if you believe the truth can hide in the most unexpected places. And leave a comment below. Do you think David Sloan was the only one? How many others are out there, hiding in plain sight? Stay vigilant, stay curious. And remember, the darkness often has a way of reaching into the light,